work on the head of the Whakatipu Natural Hazards Adaptation Update. I will just open up the meeting with a kara kia. Tuia ki ronga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki waho, tuia ki roto, tuia ki te here tangata, ka ronga te pō, ka ronga te au, homiai, huiai, thank you. Look, we'll just note we've received apologies from councillors Kevin Malcolm and Kate Wilson and Alexa Forbes, who will have to leave early. Don't know if anyone...
Leaving early, apologies.
And Councillor Scott leaving early is an important bike ride. So, all right. Right, thank you. Well, look, one of the Otago Regional Council's job is, of course, to help keep our communities safe in the face of natural hazards. An important part of that is the provision of information. So if we know important stuff, we must make that information available to the people whose lives it will affect. So we've got a lot of information that we're going to be hearing today. The slides are up here. They're also, for those who have access to Diligent, available in the Resource Centre, Safety and Resilience Committee, and it's headed the Lake Whakatipu Workshop, so they're there to follow as well. As I say, there is a lot of information here. This presentation will be in sort of 3 parts, or possibly 4. We'll have a quick introduction from our panel here. Then we've got some online presenters talking about the Glenorchy and Kinloch risk analysis, then some further work information to hear about the recent floodplain feasibility investigations, and then a look at the adaptation pathways and where we're going from here. So look, very good to have such a distinguished panel in front of us. I can see Jamie, and we have then Anna from Becca, welcome, and Tim and Jean-Luc. So I think I will hand over to you. In terms of questions, we do have a lot to get through, and so we will stick to our timetable. So we will make sure we do not run past 3:30 for this. Who knows, it could be earlier. In terms of questions, we'll get each of those presentations done, and at the conclusion of each of those sort of 3 or 4 sections, we'll have questions then, unless there's something that you really don't understand and need clarified at that moment. So look, if I can hand over the panel for you for the introduction. Thanks.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Today is quite an important day for the Head of the Lake work program. We're going to present some new technical information, and some of it is relatively complex. We're going to talk about risks. In the past, we presented a lot of information around hazards, but this time it's really combining the hazard and consequence, and we'll be talking about risks. That's the first time I'm going to do that for Head of the Lake. But the workshop is in 2 folds, basically. One is about providing you information and giving you the opportunity to ask questions on complex matters. And we have the different technical experts who did the work presenting and available all through the workshop. But the second fold is more around presenting what adaptation pathway could look like, and also how we're going to develop the strategy. And then we'd like to use this forum as a sounding board. Now is the time kind of to have feedback on that. So consider the second part of the workshop as a more interactive type, and feel free to give us views or comments on strategy or pathways that we're going to talk about.
Thank you very much. Yep, you carry on.
Oh yes, I finished. So agenda is on the screen. It's quite a lot to go through, so we'll try to stick to time. But especially for part 4, that's where we are a bit more fluid in terms of questions and information sharing. But just very few slides to recap the purpose of the work and where we are at in the program. So just as a reminder, you've heard that before, but I think it's quite important to reiterate the need for adaptation for the head of Lake Whakatipu. The key message here is really it's a complex multi-hazard environment. So we're talking flood and also geologic hazard, seismic hazard, and how those two, what will be the consequence of those hazards in the area. The other challenge in that part of Otago is the fact that the landscape is very dynamic. Things change. Rivers change bed, sediment supply, it's a constant supply of sediment coming down the catchment and depositing that at the head of the lake in the delta areas. And on top of that, we've got climate also that is changing. And climate is a big driver for those processes. So the challenge is first understand that those aspects and how they impact hazards, but also there's no simple solution to manage those hazards. We're not in a situation where we've got one hazard that we've identified and we can propose a relatively standard engineering approach. We have to deal with the complexity of multi-hazard, but also the fact that there's a lot of unknowns in the future. We know things are changing, but we don't know when things will happen and to what scale. But we know also that we need to deal with that situation. So we are using tools to help us deal with that and put plans together. So the purpose of the work really is about put a plan when we don't know exactly what the future is going to bring. Just as a series of photos to visually represent what the flood hazard looks like in Glenorchy and the head of the lake. So those are photos from past events, 2020 on the left and 1999, showing the one possible extent of flooding in Glenorchy, and the flooding there is a combination of lake flooding and river flooding. And on the bottom photo showing also the consequence of flooding on infrastructure and effects on roads. Next, please. This slide is also a reminder of the amount of technical work that has been done in the past by ORC to better understand the hazards. And what we have is on the left is a map showing the flood hazard, one of the scenarios tested, showing the different flood hazard characteristic for the area and the different sources. So the Dartner Reef on the extreme left and the Buckleburn flooding on the right, but also the liquefaction hazard. It's quite key to have done those studies because we can look into more detail on what those hazards will mean for the community, for Glenorchy, for Kinloch, and then inform future decision making. So a reminder of what we're trying to achieve. It's really about managing risk and increasing resilience of the area. And that's in line with the ORC strategic direction. One of them is really specific around resilience. And the approach we've taken is a holistic approach, not only considering the physical characteristic or the physical environment, but also looking to the social environment, putting the community at the center of the work. And also dealing with uncertainties. So through the year, we presented a lot of information, a lot of those building blocks to support decision making, and we're getting close to that time where we're shifting from information development to more decision making or strategy development. And right from the start, the approach taken by ORC was to engage with the community. So it was really to share any information we had with the community when we know it. So really being transparent, being open about the information about what it is. We made really several presentations, usually with the different technical experts being available for questions. So really making sure everyone understands what we're doing and offer them the ability to ask questions. And we didn't do that in isolation. We worked with CreateDC right at the start, Manitoba, and the community, like I said. So our approach is using the Ministry for the Environment 2017 guideline that has been updated in 2024. Those guidelines are the best practice in New Zealand around adaptation. What you've got on the screen is the figure is a summary of the approach. So if you focus on the outside of the circle, you've got 5 questions that really guided our work. Going from what's happening, so that's understanding the physical environment, understanding the potential changes of that physical environment, through to what people value, what can we do about it, and the next 2 questions are really about implementation, making the strategy work and monitoring that. We've used this approach as well. That's the same approach we're using in South Dunedin and on the Crystal Delta. Really, this is really appropriate when we have complex situation where we can't really use the standard option A, B, and C approach, and we need to consider different pathways and options. We've tried to put all the work completed or underway under that approach. We've got the 5 questions at the top of that figure on the screen, highlighting the work that's been completed in green and are the work that's need to be done in white or underway in orange. Today we're going to focus on those areas highlighted in blue. So that's kind of the first part of the workshop, the information explanation, and also in the area highlighted in red, which is really about the development of the strategy and what, now that we know the physical environment and how this is going in the future, what can we do about that?
Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. Look, just at this early stage, are there any questions from councillors about anything before we move on? No, no questions. That's good. Well, Tim, looks as though it's perhaps over to you, and you might be introducing our presenters, perhaps, amongst other things.
That's right. So yeah, pleased to be able to present today the findings from a natural hazard risk assessment project that we've completed for Glenorchy and Kinloch. And it's really a project that builds on and draws together a lot of the natural hazards analysis work that's been done over the last few years. And it's a way to bring all that together and take a systematic approach to assessing and describing those natural hazard risks. And it's a real key report for us, giving us that detailed risk understanding of the natural hazard risks and a real solid evidence base for the decision making of where do we go from here now that we have this understanding of the hazards and risks. And it's a real complement to some of the other projects as well, such as the social and economic impact assessment that was also completed earlier this year. And it's important to note that this risk assessment is a piece of work that was requested by members of the community as well as something they considered quite important. So the work was undertaken by Becca. And I'm pleased to introduce the team who will present their work. So we have Anna Punt here in person, and online Elliot Tuck and Marcus Gibson. So Anna was the project manager for the project. It's a principal in engineering geology at Becca, with a focus on slope stability and geohazard risk assessments. Elliot is a principal for hydrology at Becca. He led the flooding risk analysis component of the investigation. Marcus is a principal of geotech engineering at Becca. So geotechnical engineer and he led the liquefaction risk analysis part of this investigation. So with that, I'll hand over to Anna.
Right. Thank you. Just on to the next slide. So that's just an overview of what we'll be running through today. So it's the risk analysis process, the hazards that we've assessed, and the outputs from that risk analysis being risk levels. And I'll touch on risk tolerability to the community at the end. So as Jean-Luc said, what we're presenting on today is the risk from the natural hazards, not the natural hazards themselves. That work was presented previously. And just, I guess, a reminder of the areas that we're talking about here in this image. So we've got two study areas, Kinloch and Glenorchy, and the blue dashed line within Glenorchy is the extent of the liquefaction study area. The solid line is the flood study area, so it's slightly different based on the availability of data and the area affected. So this is an overview of the process we've followed in our risk analysis. So at the top, we've got the hazard definition work. So this is the input to the study, and this is the work that was conducted by others and presented to you 2 years ago, I believe. So that's liquefaction analysis conducted by Tonkin and Taylor, and flood modelling conducted by Lamb River Sea. So this information was used to input into the risk assessment process, which is 2 stages, the qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis. Both follow the Otago Regional Policy Statement guidance on risk analysis. So the qualitative is the first stage, and this is, it uses judgment and observations to define a risk level in accordance with the risk terminology shown here: acceptable, tolerable, and significant. And significant hazards assessed as significant through the process are taken through to the next stage, which is a more detailed quantitative analysis. This provides a numerical risk value, and then risk is recategorized in accordance with the same terminology from the qualitative assessment. And the quantitative is the main focus of what we'll be presenting today. So this work is finalised this week, so it's recent. It's undergone peer review by Tonkin and Taylor, who did the liquefaction assessment. And so with the output of this risk analysis work complete, the next step is engaging with the community in relation to risk tolerability. So I'm going to discuss the risk analysis methods a bit more over in a couple of slides. So this is just setting the scene on what the study isn't. This is a summary of the limitations of the scope. So the first point, that the study isn't property or people specific. What that means is we've assumed that people or buildings could be present anywhere within the study areas. This allows for relative comparison of risk levels, and it means it's still relevant when things change, like building locations. The study is based on existing climate, environment, land use, and built environment, so it's a snapshot of the current time. And on the process, so there's currently no New Zealand agreed methodology on risk analysis at present. We have followed the Otago Regional Policy Statement guidance on risk methodology, and while that's relatively new, it's based on an established methodology from the Australian Geomechanics Society, which has been used in Otago and New Zealand quite widely for landslide hazards to date. So this is just an overview of the qualitative risk analysis process. So the relationship at the top shows that risk is a function of hazard and consequence. The qualitative analysis uses descriptive terms to define risk levels based on likelihood and consequence. It's assessed for health and safety, which is injuries and death. The built environment, which is buildings and lifelines, so water supply, power, telecommunications, and infrastructure. And risks are assessed in accordance with this table from the Regional Policy Statement. Hazards that are assessed as significant in red are taken through to quantitative analysis for a more detailed analysis. And then this is the quantitative risk analysis process. Quantitative analysis provides a numerical expression of risk. It's undertaken for life risk and property risk, and we have the definitions for the two there. So the difference from the qualitative assessment is that lifelines are not assessed as part of a quantitative risk analysis. The focus is on life risk and property risk, and that's in accordance with the Regional Policy Statement guidance. So the risk relationship here shows that there are 4 conditional probabilities and used to determine risk. So there's an annual probability of a hazard occurring, a spatial probability of an impact of a hazard in a particular area, a temporal probability, which for people is a proportion of the time present in that area affected by the hazard. And it takes into account the ability of people to evade a hazard. So for a slow developing hazard, people are more likely to be able to get away from it. And for property, the temporal probability is 1 because property is always there. And for vulnerability, so that is given all of these things occur, for people, it's the probability of death as a result of the hazards. And for property, it's the expected proportion of property value lost in the event of a hazard occurring. And so the output of that is a risk value, which is typically displayed in scientific notation. So as seen on the previous slides, the risk value calculated is then categorized into risk levels, as shown here in accordance with the regional policy statement. These categories are the same for life and property risk. So in the study, we've assessed them for existing developments, and for new developments, the tolerability levels are an order of magnitude lower. So just a bit of guidance on what these terms mean. So tolerable risks are defined as risks that a society can live with, and significant risks are risks that exceed tolerable guidance. So this is an overview of the hazards that have been assessed, first qualitatively in the second and third columns, and then quantitatively in the last 2 columns. So the process for the identification of hazards was that there was a long list of natural hazards identified by the hazards team ORC. Some of these were not assessed following a review of the hazards and community exposure and availability of data. These were Gorge Creek in Kinloch, Lake Whakatipu tsunami, debris flow from Buckler Burn, and Kinloch liquefaction. And I guess the point here being that liquefaction has been assessed for Glenorchy but not Kinloch, due to lack of availability of data for that area. So once the long list was refined to the short list, these hazards were assessed qualitatively, and then hazards with significant risk or hazards that warranted further investigation were then taken through to the quantitative analysis, which is the last 2 columns. So I'm going to hand over to Elliot, who's online, to discuss the flooding risk analysis outputs.
Great, thanks, Anna. So won't labour on this too much. Jean-Luc stole a bit of the thunder, but as we all know, flooding is nothing new to Glenorchy. We've seen it in the past and we'll see it into the future. So just some images here to highlight the type of effect it has on the community. In the past, we've seen stop banks over top on the Rees Lagoon. We've seen the lake encroaching in the settlement. And the furthest image on the right there is the result of the Buckleburn flood taking out the road to Queenstown. The 2 images in the middle, the one at the bottom there is a snip from the results that was flood model results previously done by Land River C. And I think the thing to highlight there is that it has a pretty good correlation to some of the actual images from recent events. The one in the middle with the notation on it is an image of the ground surface, the topography within Glenorchy, and I think that really highlights that it dictates the extent of flooding that we see during events with the low-lying land along the edge of the Rees River stop bank and the lake margins there. I mentioned the flood modelling results that have been done previously. That really has formed the basis of this assessment. The RPS requires 3 return periods to be assessed. So for the river flooding, we have looked at the 50-year, the 100-year, and the 500-year. So that's the same for the restart model and the Buckleburn model. Through the flooding assessment, as I mentioned, we've seen the lake encroaching in the past, so we've assessed lake level flooding as well, and the events we've looked at there are the 10-year, 20-year, and 100-year. So this slide here is just an example of the results we get from a quantitative assessment. As Anna mentioned, it's the sum of multiplying each of those different categories together. So why I wanted to highlight this slide is it shows the spatial variability of the risk across, in this case, Glenorchy and risk to life. So there's our 3 return periods at the top. We've assessed each of the flood events individually. So we've got a Buckleburn flood in the top row. We've got a Dartrees in the middle and a joint flood event along the bottom. So the joint flood event is if Restart, Buckleburn flooded at the same time, but also in the joint one, we highlighted a couple of catchments that could be at risk in Glenorchy, and one of them is Bible Stream, which you'll see on the eastern side of Glenorchy there, and another small one called the landfill catchment as well. So I guess the thing for me that stands out in these images is, again, it reflects what we've seen in reality. And another thing here is that through the assessments, so multiplying each one of those variables, we've seen that the 50-year actually produces the highest risk numbers, and that's due to the fact that part of that equation is the probability of an event occurring, and obviously a 50-year has a higher probability of occurring than, say, a 500-year. So that has increased the risk numbers along there. From these numbers, we then reclassify them, like Anna was talking about, into the acceptable, tolerable, or significant range as per the RPS, and they're obviously color coded, and we'll go into those in the next slides. So starting with risk to life from river flooding in Glenorchy and Kinloch. First of all, you'll see there's 2 missing for Kinloch there, and that's because the Buckleburn flood and the joint flood case didn't affect Kinloch, so hence the 1 image there. The other thing you'll see here is that it's a quantitative combined risk classification, so the RPS directs us to take each of our 3 return periods, so the 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year for river flooding, and combine them all together to give an overall picture of risk. And I guess that assumes that all 3 of those return periods happened in the same year. So for risk to life, we'll see here that everything is green, which is an acceptable risk based on the RPS. When we work through the qualitative range process, we found the risk to be higher than this, but actually once we added in things like the probability of it happening, that the chance that someone's there, the fact that there is a warning system, all those additional variables actually reduce the risk level to an acceptable level. Cool, next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the quantitative results for property risk. So the standout here is that, as the other slides and I've mentioned before, you're really seeing the highest property risk occurring along the edges of the Rees Lagoon stop bank and along the lake margins, and of course within the riverbeds themselves, like the Buckleburn there. You'll also see that the joint scenario adds some significant risk to the eastern side of Glenorchy, where Bible Stream comes down there. So yeah, and another thing in the Buckleburn and joint, you'll see a small line of red risk coming down the main road to Queenstown there, and that's probably highlights what happened in the 99 event, where the road washed out due to the bed level changes. So it reflects what we've seen in the past, which is great. For Kinloch, we see a significant risk essentially east of the Kinloch Road, There's quite a dramatic lift in topography there. So anything, to the east of that, including the road itself, is in the significant risk category. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we looked at lake flooding as well for the 3 return periods, and I guess this isn't so much a dynamic model. This is, let's take the land surface and put our different events on it, so the 10-year, 20-year, and the 100-year. It's kind of plotted on top of the LiDAR and fills in anything that's lower than that. So this hasn't come from a hydrodynamic model like the river ones have. Again, this is combined, so it's the 10, 20, and 100-year combined for both Kinloch and Glenorchy. Now, we haven't assessed life risk for lake flooding. The assumption there is that there's adequate warning. The rate of rise of the lake is quite a bit, it takes a lot longer for it to flood from the lake than it does, say, the river or a stop bank overtopping. And that gives people ample time to evacuate and leave the area. For property risk or property damage, often it's a kind of velocity times depth scenario. And in this case, the depths are at a point that that damage would still occur even with low velocities. So the results themselves are very similar to the river flooding, with the lower margins along the edge of the lake and the lagoon showing the significant risk in Glenorchy. And again, in Kinloch, anything that's closer to the Dart River itself, containing a higher risk. Great, and I think that's me for flooding.
Thanks, Elliot. Good afternoon. So for the areas of Glenorchy, as mentioned, we've been looking at earthquake damage. So earthquake damage is, we've been looking at ground shaking, liquefaction, and lateral spread. What we found in the qualitative assessment was that the risk of shaking was quite low relative to lateral spread and liquefaction, just due to the severity of the damage to the land associated with that. So for the quantitative assessment, the focus was on the liquefaction and lateral spread. So just briefly about what liquefaction and lateral spread is, there's some images here showing examples of dominantly lateral spread damage. So you end up with cracking of the ground, and damage to buildings pulling apart. Liquefaction is sort of a result of shaking, soil conditions that are vulnerable, generally weak soil. There's a presence of groundwater. The shaking results in an increase of pressure, and that changes the state of the soil for a period of time, and that can lead to the ground becoming unstable. And what can be seen in the schematic below is the ground spreading towards a free face. In Glenorchy, we've got free faces bounding Glenorchy with the lake, sort of a very high free face in the order of 25 meters, and then we've got the free faces adjacent with the rivers. And yeah, it's just that quite a large magnitude of displacement. If we can go to the next slide. So we've used, as Anna mentioned before, the hazard assessment that was undertaken by Tonkin and Taylor. So they did an investigation, assessed risk of liquefaction, assessed land damage, both from liquefaction and from lateral spread. So just on the bottom left-hand corner here, there's an image of lateral spread with the dominant lateral spread going towards the river margins. Quite large magnitudes are expected, varying between the earthquake scenarios. So we've taken that information and classified an assessment of land damage in sort of 3 categories here, which we've color-coded, is none to minor, minor to moderate, and moderate to severe, for an upper bound and lower bound scenario based on the hazard data. We've done this because it ties in well with the Ministry of Environment and MB guidance for planning guidance for planning liquefaction prone land. Also, it ties in well with data recording and observations in the Canterbury area, so it allows us to align well. So we've used this to form the basis of the assessment. Okay, if we can. So the scenarios that we've covered is a 25-year return period earthquake, which is sort of is a frequent earthquake, typically an SLS earthquake for building design, and then an alpine fault earthquake, which is a notable earthquake scenario for the area, just considering the expected rupture of that in the next 50 years is quite high. The probability is quite high, so it's a specific event of consideration, and we've considered a 250-year return period earthquake probabilistic. What was found during the hazard assessment was that beyond 250-year return period, while there was minor increases in land damage, the increase was moderate for increasing severity of earthquake. So these three scenarios provide a good range across the level of damage. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So we did a qualitative assessment and a quantitative assessment. What we found, and we only undertook the quantitative assessment for property damage, property risk. The reason we did that is we found in the qualitative assessment that the risk to life was acceptable. So what we found is that due to the severity of the land damage that was shown on the previous slide, that the risk up to property was actually quite high, and that results both for individual earthquake scenarios and combined earthquake scenario that the risk exceeds the tolerable levels that Anna explained earlier, and we have significant risk over the entire area. It is noted that the southeastern sector of Glenorchy does have lower levels of damage, but even considering those lower levels of damage, it's still assessed as a significant risk. Key reasons for the high risk that's been assessed is the severity of the land damage that's been assessed, even for quite modest return periods. The 25-year return period has quite large land damage, and especially the lateral spread near the lake margins. And even quite small levels of land damage can actually lead to quite large proportions of building damage. Building damage leading to quite large proportion of the cost of the buildings for repair. So even minor levels of damage can pose quite a high risk. So that was the key outcomes of the assessment is quite clearly a significant risk across the entire area for Glenorchy. So I'll pass you back to Anna.
So this is a results summary of the qualitative and quantitative analysis in accordance with the risk categories defined in the regional policy statement. So the quantitative analysis refined the results of the qualitative analysis. So you can see the outputs from the quantitative in the purple box on the right. So what this shows is that life risk is acceptable for all flooding hazards assessed for all of Glenorchy and Kinloch. You can see that the restart health and safety risk from the qualitative analysis was assessed as significant, but as Elliot said, with additional metrics taken into account in the quantitative analysis, that was refined to acceptable, and similarly for Butler Burn. So life risk is acceptable for all areas assessed, and property risk is significant for all hazards assessed quantitatively. So for liquefaction, that's the whole of Glenorchy, and for flooding, it's areas along the lake and river margins. So next slide. What this means in terms of risk tolerability. So the risk levels we've talked about in this study of acceptable, tolerable and significant are based on the threshold levels provided in the regional policy statement guidance. But the regional policy statement also says this quote on the left, which means that it is down to the community and the local authorities to determine what is a tolerable risk level for that community. So the next step of this project is to present the findings to the community and to inform those discussions. Just a bit of an explanation of this graph here. So
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Soon.
this is the last slide. So this graph shows life risk tolerability against common risk metrics and regional policy statement guidance. So risk increases to the right, and with increasing risk is decreasing tolerability of the community. So you can see the range of flooding results for Glenorchy and Kinloch in relation to the regional policy statement tolerability levels, which shows that it's tolerable for existing developments, and it just exceeds the tolerability criteria for new developments for those areas along the river and lake margins. There is no equivalent kind of data or graph for property risk. So the application of property risk analysis is relatively new in New Zealand, and there is less published data on tolerability in relation to property risk, which then feeds back into the community engagement process.
Thank you very much indeed. So look, thank you, Anna, Elliot and Marcus. Look, I forgot to mention before that this workshop is being recorded and will be publicly available tomorrow. So look, we'll open up to questions, and Brian will be first in line. Questions initially, and then councillors might have comments on how this information inputs into the adaptation program. But let's see how we go for questions first. Brian.
Cool. If I could
Just pop your mic on.
just go back 2 slides, please. Yes, I may have missed it, so I apologise. But the health and safety risk versus life risk. Sorry, what's the difference between those two?
So health and safety risk takes into account injuries as well as death. Life risk is the risk of death. And the process, I guess, behind them is different. The qualitative analysis, which informs the health and safety risk, is based on descriptors, and the quantitative analysis is based on the risk calculation, quantitative risk calculation.
Okay. And what's the difference between built environment and property?
So built environment takes into account buildings, so property, and lifelines. So water supply, telecommunications, roads. Property risk is just buildings.
Okay. Okay. So, and as a general conclusion, what should we take out of that table?
I guess the key point really, and probably wasn't known at the start of the study, is that life risk is acceptable for these areas, which is quite evident in that, clear in that table, and that property risk has been assessed as significant in accordance with the guidance in the regional policy statement, but it very much is dependent on the community and their feelings on what is tolerable to them. So I suppose what you should take from it is it feeds into the process of engaging with the community.
And there's still, so all your property and your built environment, that as a generalised comment, it's significant risk. And maybe from a health and safety and life, it's generally acceptable, but there's significant health and safety if there's a restart flood.
I suppose I would just clarify there that the qualitative assessment is refined by the quantitative. So during the quantitative assessment, it doesn't take into account things like the ability of people to evade a hazard. So with warning times and various other considerations. But in the quantitative analysis, that is taken into account. So what you should take there is that really the 2 columns on the right are the final outputs.
Yeah. So to conclude, is the conclusion that people are generally okay, but it's a property thing? So is the problem an insurance issue, basically? Because if I went and moved up there, I'd be okay. I'd have a house. One day I mightn't have a house, but if the insurance company was fine about it, I could rebuild it.
I might hand over to Tim and Jean-Luc there, but I guess, insurance and resilience to the community.
I think insurance is one part of the potential mitigation, but there is also ability for people to take into account the hazard and build accordingly to mitigate the risk by physical engineering work.
So I guess, in other words, this is the situation now, but that could change in the future depending on what actions are taken by the appropriate agencies.
It is a definition of risk now, taking into account what is already been done, for example, in terms of flood warning, but it is a snapshot of now, and the program is about understanding this to see what else can be done to reduce the risk.
Okay, Brian?
Yeah.
We'll move on. Elliot and then Tim.
I just had a few. I was wondering, with the life risk modelling, how sort of wide that scope was. Like, is it just would it just be direct deaths from the natural disaster, or could that also cover, you know, if electricity was out for a week, there someone dying as an indirect result of that, or
Yeah, no, it's the direct impacts of the hazard. Yeah.
And then I was curious if there were any modelling done on when we looked at like the 150 years, like 100 year, and so the differences between if there was any modelling done on repeated floods within a specific period of time. So if you had a really wet year 1 year, and obviously that's less likely, but would the impacts of that be enough to make that a big concern as well?
Do you want to answer that one, Elliot?
Yeah. So the short answer is no. There hasn't, from my understanding, there hasn't been ones with different antecedent conditions and things like that. But I think that's why the RPS says, okay, let's combine all the events, the 50, 100, and 500 in this case, and define the risk based on the combined event. So all of them happening in the same year. So I guess that goes some way to cover what you're talking about.
Yeah, cool. And then just on the sort of the modeling's done on current conditions. So obviously we can't say like there is an X chance of X happening in the next 20 years because we're not accounting for those conditions and risks and stuff. Do we have any idea if or when that life risk would increase towards the past the tolerable limit? Acceptable limit.
I don't know if Elliot's going to jump in here, but
Yeah, you can go first, Anna.
I don't know if you have the numbers available to you. I think it was 10 to the -6 to 10 to the -7, and the tolerable threshold is 10 to the -4, so it is quite a lot lower.
So require
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
a significant increase in whatever factors are going into the model. Yeah. And then I was just wondering on that graph that we have with the life risk, and yeah, that one. How would you describe that risk when you're comparing it to something like assault? Like
It's a really
how do you say that like the Glenorchy flooding is less or more risky than getting assaulted that year or whatever?
I think the most relevant one that people normally focus on is risk of being killed in a car crash. So it's less close to an order of magnitude lower than the risk of dying in a car crash.
Is that assuming you live in Glenorchy?
Yes, for those residents of Glenorchy.
Right, gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thanks. Look, I'm aware Elisa needs to leave early, so we'll get her to jump the queue. Go to you next.
Thank you for that. Don't have to leave just yet, but if we go back to the next slide, so the next one over there, that one there. So we've got the property risk significant, which is a lot better than catastrophic, so it's not as bad as some of us might thought it might be. And the next thing is, but if we leap ahead, is it possible to reduce that risk with actions that are taken? Can that risk be lowered? With adaptation tactics.
So sorry, what I couldn't hear what hazard you were referring to.
Well, any of the hazards there.
Okay.
So you've got property risk and your quantitative assessment, and that's listed as significant on a whole pile of things. Can that risk be lowered by taking adaptation or mitigation actions?
Yeah, well, I can comment on liquefaction. So there's ways to improve the resilience of new structures, but there's still a risk there. I think it will. There is engineering solutions available. It may take it down to tolerable, but it would be a significant expenditure that would be required. My gut feeling is that that it would largely sit in the significant zoning, but it would be about how to manage the damage and because it's a property damage that we're talking about. It's not life, so it's about how do we manage it, how do we get people back into their homes, how do we fix lifelines and such like. It's a bit different for the flooding, which I think
yeah. So I guess to answer your question from the flooding point of view, yes, there is things that keep floodwaters out of the community, but of course that there's still things involved in that, like what return period are you going to protect the township over, and that's where risk comes in, and figuring out what risk level the community is prepared to take based on an engineering solution. In Glenorchy, obviously you've got the Rees, the lake, and the Buckleburn, so reasonable issues to deal with there from an engineering point of view.
Okay, thanks.
So I'll just add to that, and that question is a focus of the latter part of this workshop, and we'll jump in and explore kind of the range of sort of adaptation or flood mitigation options as an example.
So just quickly, do we eventually get to a residual risk? Some sort of residual risk?
There will be a residual risk.
Okay.
Yes, there certainly will be a residual risk. So as we noted at the beginning and have noted all along, that there isn't an easy solution to these particular risks. And so the residual risk would be part of the tolerability of what people are what's acceptable to them living there, and how you can modify that. There's lots of different ways you can, and for example, flood forecasting and warning is part of the modification of risk, right? And so on and so forth. So it's a mosaic of possible responses that could, add additional resilience. But we don't have we don't have a single easy solution because it's very complex.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much.
And I guess we haven't got that assessment to show what that residual risk could be, because of course it depends what actions are taken next. Councillor Methven.
I hope somebody might get excited about this question. It sort of reflects a little bit about who I am. The quantitative risk calculation, the equation that you've got there, you've got spatial probability and temporal probability as part of that calculation. What exactly are those probabilities? Because they've actually informed the result.
So I can talk generally, and maybe I'll get Marcus and Elliot to talk about the hazards in particular. So the spatial probability is the impact of a hazard on a specific area. So whether or not an area is affected by flooding, for example, whether floodwaters cross that area. Yeah. And the temporal is for people, the proportion of time a person is present. So you define that for the person most at risk. Yeah. And then less the ability of that person to evade the hazard. And then for buildings, it's one. Maybe Elliot, you'd like to comment on how that was determined for? Yep.
Sorry, I thought I was talking then. So yeah, for flooding, obviously the first box there, annual probability, is just the probability that the flood occurs. So a 50-year event is a 0.02% of a chance for happening in any year. The spatial one is the extent that the floodwaters cover, is probably the best way to put that. The temporal is for flooding was based on the time spent at home, and then that kind of took into account how many people are driving and things like that. So 85% of the time was the number for Glenorchy, so 0.85. vulnerability for flooding, we looked at a couple of studies there. They were studies that looked at the severity based on a velocity times depth scenario, and that's within that V times D, there's a ratio, some studies been done that's actually based on a lot of the Australian work on people's chance of dying within different velocity times depth brackets.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Andrew.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think this is all interesting stuff. In relation to life risk, have we got any data that dates back to since European occupation through to today in terms of loss of life, occurrence of injury, etc.? Do we have that data sort of as a sort of a background or something to a reference point, I suppose?
Do you want to jump in, Elliot, because you have the most information?
Yeah, I've never seen it. The studies we use for that life risks were all foreign studies. So knows my answer. For property was a bit easier. You know, NIWA's gone around and checked what damage different floods have done at different depths. So you know, we could get damage curves from that, but there wasn't the same type of data available within New Zealand for life risk.
Lloyd, were you wanting to question something? Yes.
Well,
You go.
just for clarification, so you got your natural hazard risk summary, and if it gets into significant, does that mean that the risk is perceived to be beyond RPS tolerable risk level?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's not far ahead, but it's just more risky.
So actually,
it's just outside.
In terms of property risk, it's over an order of magnitude ahead. So it's 10 to the minus 2. So the tolerable threshold is 10 to the minus 4. Think orders of magnitude.
It's not far along. And another thing I was just going to ask, because did I pick it up right towards the end? Somebody basically said at the end of the day, the community will determine the risk.
That's what the RPS says. And maybe if you want to jump a few slides ahead, there's a quote directly from the RPS, and that is generally kind of accepted risk methodology that communities and local authorities determine what's tolerable to them. And that allows for different levels of tolerability in different environments.
Yeah, so some communities or people within the community have higher tolerance levels than some others, depending on their state of whatever. Yeah.
But it
Well,
actually
that's fine.
says it's the local authority determines and has to consult with the community. So it's no different than what happens to here. So it's not actually the community that determines, it's the local authority.
I think we'll be talking about this in that last part of that discussion, won't we? When we're talking about the adaptation pathways in there. Will we? Am I right to think we'll be covering some of those sorts of issues there?
I think we mentioned them. I don't think we'll be covering them in huge detail at that workshop.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just?
Yeah, Andrew.
On that last question, surely it'll be a requirement under the whatever act it is, Natural Hazards Act, that local authorities have got to do what is stated in the RPS. I imagine that wording probably replicates what's in the whatever relevant act that exists.
To consider a lot of
for
things.
local authorities to inform their communities about natural hazards.
Just on that, you're aware of the financial expenditure select committee current investigation. So they're looking at an adaptation framework, which I think will have that discussion. But also last week we had an announcement from Mr. Bishop around further work being done around natural hazard risk and tolerability. I don't have a lot of detail of what is behind this, but my understanding is that we'll be providing guidance on how to determine risk for New Zealand, and also how to have those discussions around what risk means and what to do about it. And work, I think they're mentioning 2025 to have that work completed.
Thanks. Look, time is ticking by, so I think councillors, if you have further comments, we'll keep them for that later part of the discussion. I just had one thing I was going to ask about, and I noted when you were first speaking, you talked about lake level flooding and tsunami. Is there something more we need to know about tsunami?
So we didn't include lake tsunami in the risk analysis, in part because there's not supporting information. There's not enough information to conduct a risk analysis on it. I believe there's a PhD currently underway that would allow for kind of refined commentary on risk levels. I mean, in our lakes, there is a risk from lake station tsunami. So landslides impacting the lake and resulting in tsunami.
I can add a little bit to that. Yes, so there's a partially completed PhD project which is currently looking at the lake bed morphology and evolution of the lake through time. Part of that includes identifying landslides which have impacted the lake bed, and you can use that as an information point to make interpretations about potential past tsunami on the lake. And we're in parallel with that work, also in discussion with NIWA about a project to investigate that lake tsunami hazard further.
Yep. Okay. Yep. No, good. Thanks. Well, look, perhaps we'd better move on. So, look, thank you again, Anna, Elliot, and Marcus. And perhaps if I can get one of the panel to introduce the next section of the presentation. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Alan. So, yeah, the second technical study we're presenting today was work that was carried out by Damwatch Engineering, and it was an investigation of potential floodplain management interventions, both for flooding and erosion hazards at various points on the Dark Reefs floodplain. And it builds on the higher level study that was completed in 2022, which gave us a sort of high level pros and cons assessment of various floodplain management approaches. But this builds on that as a more detailed assessment of the feasibility for selected interventions. It really complements the risk assessment findings you've seen to really start thinking about, we've looked at the risk, now what can we do about it? Just point out that project was partially funded by Ministry for the Environment through the Nature-Based Solutions program. And joining us online, we have Dr. Grant Webby and Bill Veal, who will present the findings. Grant was the project leader for this investigation. He's a principal engineer at Damwatch Engineering, with a focus on hydraulic structures investigation, flood management, and river engineering. Bill is a senior civil engineer at Damwatch and project manager, and he's got over 15 years experience, including river engineering. So over to Grant and Bill, if you're online.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Tim. And just a quick microphone check, because you can hear me okay, Tim?
All good, thanks.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So for the next 20 minutes, I'll be talking about the Restart River Floodplain Intervention Options Assessment, which our team at Damwatch has carried out this year. So if we just skip to the next slide. So I'm going to be covering the scope and objectives of the assessments, how we carried them out, and the key findings and outcomes. And of course, there's an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. And if you need it, there's further detail on the intervention option assessments in these 3 reports listed here, and they'll be made publicly available by ORC soon. And finally, by way of introduction, this map just shows the geographic location of the assessment areas. So our scope covered firstly the lower Reefs, through Left Bank, floodplain, and Glenorchy. Also the Dart River right bank floodplain on the left side of the image there, and also the Upper Reese true left and right bank floodplains, focusing around the Reese River Bridge in that instance. So we'll move on to the scope and objectives. So basically the scope of the current study was to assess the viability of potential options that mitigate the existing hazards in these areas. And I'm not going to describe the hazards because we've covered them, or they've been covered earlier in the session, but there are more details on those hazards in those assessment reports. We then provide an evidence base to rule out various flood management options. And for the viable options, we tested their alignment with nature-based solutions approach to floodplain management, which I'll talk a bit more about later. And then finally, the viable options were taken forward to a concept level design stage. So that's drawings, quantities, and costs. Outside of the scope, so it's always good to know the limitations. Basically, backwater flooding from high water levels in Lake Whakatipu weren't considered. So that's a different flood hazard from the river flooding. And as Becca have been talking about, they've analysed that to some degree. Also, we didn't look at options to raise or lengthen the existing Reese River Bridge, or options to reroute the existing Kinloch Road. Both those assets are owned by QLDC, as far as I'm aware. Also, we didn't go back and look at options which were previously discounted in that 2022 floodplain adaptation workshop, which Tim mentioned earlier. Right, so the next couple of slides, I'll just talk about the general approach we took to the assessments. And then following that, I'll talk about the more specific results on those three focus areas I showed on that map earlier. So if we go to the next slide. So the general approach was firstly to develop an understanding of the existing flood hazard and geomorphological setting of the Restart River system. So we did that by review of existing reports and studies and analysis of different data sets available. Then basically using that understanding, and also from that 2022 workshop, we developed potential floodplain options with the aim of reducing flood hazards and put those into a two-dimensional computational hydraulic model, in this case HECRAS, which enabled us to test them out in terms of their effectiveness. Next slide, please. The next stage in the assessment was, but we looked at the options in terms of meeting floodplain management objectives and alignment with nature-based solutions. So some of you may have heard that term before, nature-based solutions, but for those of you who haven't, it's basically focusing on natural features like providing room for the river or storage areas, vegetated areas, rather than hard engineering structures for floodplain or flood hazard management. And there's some examples in that diagram on the left there. And I guess generally there's a sort of philosophy within river engineering practice in New Zealand and internationally to focus more on these types of solutions than engineering solutions which get overwhelmed or outflanked in more extreme events. And then for the viable options, we developed a concept level design, and that included drawings and indicative construction costs, a preliminary review of consenting, design and construction considerations. We also tested the designs for their long-term resilience, so looking at climate change impacts as well as riverbed level aggradation changes, and also flagged out potential issues and further work for any
future detailed design phase if that path is taken. So hopefully that gives you a general overview of the approach to the assessment. So now I'll go through some of the key findings for each of those areas. So if we move forward for the lower Rees, I'll start with that one. And if we move on to the next slide, basically the options which were tested here, and these arose mainly out of the 2022 floodplain floodplain management workshop. So option A is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically raising the existing flood bank at Glenorchy. So there's a existing bank which skirts around the northern edge of the town. It currently has about a 1 in 20 AEP level of service, and basically raising that to meet a higher level of service. I'll talk about that more in a minute because that was found to be a viable solution, and I'll give the reasons behind that. Options B and C both weren't found to be effective. Option B was essentially trying to reduce breakouts on the left bank of the Rees River, running down that left bank floodplain and impacting Glenorchy. Option B was a mitigation approach using flood banks or bunding to try and prevent flood breakouts. However, these had limited success, either due to outflanking or overtopping, and the height at which they needed to be constructed. And also they were counter to NBS solutions, which but basically not looking to build new flood banks, which need a lot of asset maintenance, but also vulnerable to long-term climate change impacts and riverbed level aggradation. I guess the other point is that the left bank floodplain of the Rees is a large, relatively untouched floodplain. So if you start building structures in there, you're immediately counter to those nature-based solution principles. And then option C was a vegetated buffer. So basically planting a very dense sort of forest or thicket with the idea that that would help to buffer or try and deflect flows back into the river. Unfortunately, that wasn't effective. Just the nature of the steeply sloping floodplains meant that the river basically continued to charge through there without much deflection occurring due to that vegetated buffer. So I'll move on to option A if we change the slide. So this option was found to be potentially viable, and I'll explain it a little bit. Basically, the yellow part of that diagram is the existing flood bank footprint. The pink area is where the flood bank would need to project towards Glenorchy due to raising. We'd be looking to raise the embankment by about 1 metre, sort of nominally, to provide a 1 in 100 AEP or return period level of service. And like I said before, the current stop bank has about a 1 in 20 return period level of service. So it was viable in terms of reducing flood impacts on the properties behind it. It was also tested to be effective and resilient under long-term climate change or future climate change scenarios, as well as riverbed level aggradation scenarios. But of course, it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't provide mitigation against lake level flooding. So basically the existing stop bank and any raised stop bank would still be outflanked to that southwest side due to lake level flooding.
And of course, it would remain vulnerable to over-design flood events, so things in the order of 1 in 500 AEP or more. Right, so hopefully that gives you a overview of the Lower Reese findings. For the Dart River, which is where I'll focus on next, if we just flick to the next slide. So the scale of flood hazard is very challenging to defend against in this area with conventional engineering solutions such as flood banks. There's a range of hazards going on here. Obviously, the magnitude of the floods in terms of just discharge, the amount of breakout onto the floodplains, coupled with riverbank erosion or migration, and also riverbed level aggradation. So the intervention options here focused on trying to mitigate that riverbank migration, which has been ongoing for some time. Trying to prevent damage to Kinloch Road, which has been flooded on several occasions in the past, and trying to reduce the rate of farmland loss between the road and the riverbank to try and provide a buffer or protection from the river to the road. So we'll move on to the next slide. So the intervention options selected here were a combination of rockfill and vegetated buffer protections, and they were prioritized to allow staged implementation. So the philosophy here was really to try and hold the line of the riverbank. So what's happening here is the edge, or the true right edge of the river, has been migrating over time towards the road, with quite a significant loss of farmland over the years. The road is that black line on the image with the sort of numbers sticking off it. And you can see the black areas, the thick black lines, where QLDC has already put in rockfill bank protection. Basically where the river's edge is getting so close to the road that they're concerned that the road would be undermined due to riverbank erosion and future floods. So what the proposal is basically to supplement the rock in that area and have a more continuous belt of rock to try and keep the river's edge there and prevent the erosion of the road. So that would be priority areas, basically where you don't have much buffer between the river's edge and the road, and where you're looking to use rockfill protection, so the red areas. Where you have a bit more buffer, we're basically promoting or proposing a vegetation buffer. And basically that is planting, and we can talk about the types of planting later if you want, but basically that vegetation buffer through the root network holds that bank when it's established and prevents that lateral erosion. So the green areas are where you have less buffer between the river's edge and the road. The brown areas are a lower priority, or the brown lines, because as you can see there's a lot more buffer between the road and the riverbank. So you have a bit more time to act in those areas. I mean, there's residual risks with this option. Obviously, planting needs to take time to root and establish before it provides good edge protection. So there's always a risk that you go ahead and plant, but it gets washed away in a large flood before it can be established. We also looked at locally raising the road in places, because that really would be complementary to these options which are trying to hold the bank's edge. So these options don't prevent flooding over the road. So some combination of the two may be helpful at reducing flood hazards. So that's all I've got on that one. But of course, we'll field questions at the end. And then moving on to the Upper East, I think we've got a few minutes left to talk about that one. So if we move to the next slide, again, similar to the data, a very challenging area due to almost identical reasons. Under flood conditions here, there is insufficient conveyance capacity through the bridge waterway to contain the whole flood discharge. And basically the river wants to naturally break out on the true left and right bank floodplains. And that's indicated by those black arrows on the figure there. Also in that figure, there's a yellow and a red line, and that indicates an existing flood bank system. However, that does get outflanked and overtopped in the larger flood events which we modelled. So if we move on to the next slide, and just a little bit of background on this part of the world, but basically the Reese River Bridge was constructed in about 1950. At the time of the construction, it was designed to allow flow through both the true right and left bank abutments. But then in the 80s, a stop bank system was constructed. There's not a lot of detail on its construction, but it included what's called the primary right bank flood bank there, which was mainly to protect farmland and the roads, and also a secondary bank, which basically that prevented flow on the right abutment of the bridge and directed flood water into the main waterway underneath the bridge. So in conjunction with channel bed aggradation, these changes have effectively lowered the level of service of the bridge. Also of note, there's a portion of the primary flood bank which is no longer intact, and we believe may have been damaged sort of in the mid-90s during flooding. So if we move on to the next slide. So this is a very, like I said, a challenging area to look at intervention options. What we focused on instead was basically trying to provide a managed floodway on either the left or the right bank approaches to the bridge. And the idea here was to guide floodplain flows into defined areas past the bridge and reduce the flood discharge and pressures through the Reese River Bridge waterway. And also looking at options which aligned with MBS, sort of room for the river strategies. And these were basically aligned with the 2022 workshop outcomes or findings. So if we move on, the options which we considered were so the three of them, and I'll just touch on them briefly. So option A, we were trying to develop a floodway where that black arrow is on the leftmost image. So trying to get more floodplain flow on that right abutment and taking the pressure off the Reese River Bridge. None of these options are designed to remove existing flood hazards to farmland or roads. Just the scale of the flooding here is significant, and trying to stop bank these systems just isn't viable from a long-term resilience point of view. But looking at that option A, so it's basically taking out a portion of the existing secondary flood bank where it's shown in white on that diagram, and then raising Priory and Glenorchy Paradise roads to divert flows along the floodway, and also at the same time that helps to raise the level of service of those roads, gets them out of the floodplain. And then option B was very similar to option A, but instead of raising the roads, we just allowed water to run over those roads as it does currently, but removing that portion of existing flood bank in white to try and open up that floodway on the right abutment. And then finally, option C was trying to look at providing more flow on the left bank floodway. Unfortunately, that option C wasn't effective. Just the lay of the land and the way the floodplains operate. Water wanted to go down the right bank floodplain preferentially, and you need to do major sort of ground works to make that floodway effective. Simply removing vegetation, which was one of the options we considered, wasn't effective there. Options A and B had some limited benefits, and we just go to the next slide. But the benefits, I guess, that they did increase flow through the right abutment, and they did reduce flow through the bridge waterway, as one of the objectives was, but at the expense of increasing flooding to the road section, which was previously partially protected by that existing flood bank, and also increases the potential for erosion damage to that portion of the road. So not a perfect solution by any means. It has some benefits, but there's a lot of residual risks. It does restore the design intention of the bridge from the 1950s, but obviously there need to be provisions for scour protection or an understanding that post-flood you may need to repair or maintain the road as a result. Right, so I think I'm pretty low on time, so I'll just wrap it up. So yeah, just to summarize, we looked at floodplain intervention options for those three areas considered, and took viable options through to the concept design stage. I haven't covered costs in this presentation, but we can talk about those in the questions if needed. And obviously next steps would include community engagement and how these options might fit into the wider adaptation strategies. Funding arrangements and constraints, land ownership, consenting, all would need to be thought of if any of these options wanted to be moved into more detailed engineering or implementation stages. So thanks for your time, and we look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. That was great to hear that. Well, look, we will open it up to those councillors who remain in the room. If you've got questions or comments on that, we're running a little behind, but we've probably got about 10 minutes. Any questions? Councillor Weir.
Sorry. I was just looking at, so for the first section around the lower rate, those three potential options are tested individually, or do we test for like any interactions between the interventions, and whether one would make another more effective or anything like that?
Yeah, maybe just flip back to that slide. I think it's quite early on. Yep, a few more, the next one back. There we go. I think that's what you're referring to. That they were looked at in isolation. So we looked at each option independently. Option C just didn't work, unfortunately. So combining that with another option wouldn't be an improvement. Option B, again, the scale of building, a 4 kilometre long flood bank, which is basically the length of that yellow line, and it's sort of counter to those nature-based solution strategies. It would be helpful if you combined B and A, but I think that the cost and the fact that it's counter to those MBS strategies just ruled it out from that perspective. If that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. But just using it, if there aren't any expected interactions between any of the other interventions even like across these different,
Yeah,
made
that's
a
good.
floodplain around the rest, would there be any impact on the rock wall at the dart or anything like that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Grant might be able to answer this, but my understanding was to be that geographically they're quite far away. For example, if you built option A, it would have no impact on say construction of rock walls on the dart in terms of a backwater effect or increasing flood hazard. So Grant's opened his mic, so if you've got a
Yeah, no, they're just too geographically separate to have any influence on each other. What I would add is that option A fully utilises the Glenorchy Lagoon as a flood storage area, so that's strongly aligned with a NBS approach.
Thanks, Grant. And thanks, Elliot. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Is it fair to assume that the options that seem to be, or the interventions that seem to be the most logical and potentially implementable, are building on what has been there in the past with the exclusion of the Dart River, having some sort of vegetation type buffer included as well? So is that sort of a fair assumption to come to with those options?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to see it. It is building on existing structures. I'll just add that there is actually some willow planting on the right bank of the Dart, and that has been or has become established. Tim might know more on when that was planted and where exactly. But yeah, even the vegetation planting proposed on the right bank of the Dart is building on existing tools, I guess, which have been used in the past.
Okay, thanks. Tim.
Just in regards to the nature-based solutions, are they as effective as engineered solutions?
It depends on the context, and there's always a trade-off with nature-based solutions, especially if you're trying to widen floodplains or provide room for the river. Stop banks are usually there to protect buildings or property on the other side of them. So if you're, say, removing stop banks or giving the room to the river, there's got to be a trade-off, and that's often, moving existing property, say, to allow room for the river. That hasn't happened in this case. We haven't proposed moving properties. Yeah, so it depends on, just back to answering the question, it depends on the circumstance. They can be much more effective long term because you're sort of allowing the hazard to roam naturally, if you like, and but equally, for example, the Glenorchy stop bank, that is an effective solution, and I guess more effective in this case than providing a vegetation buffer or something like that. Yeah, you got any comment there, Grant?
We've determined that the risk to life is minimal. We've already got some floodbanks there. If in terms of budget constraints as well, are nature-based solutions better than the engineered solutions?
Do you want to answer that one, Grant? Or?
I think they can be just as effective, if not more effective, because engineered solutions, are costly to implement. They can also be very costly to maintain. And with a nature-based solution approach, you're trying to adapt to natural situation and minimize the cost. And use nature to, if taking the Glenorchy Lagoon situation, you're trying to maximise the use of that lagoon as a flood storage area.
Thank you.
Bill, you said that for some of those options you had done some costings. It would be interesting to hear about that. Or no, John Luke.
One way to see option A is kind of a combination of already occurring nature-based solution and a little bit of engineering, because we're already benefiting from the buffering effect of the lagoon, as Brian said, but also by the fact that this river can occupy the floodplain. So it's already kind of a combination of both. And for me, one of the findings of that work is really trying to preserve that ability of the floodplain to buffer floods. So it's kind of already providing nature-based solution naturally, and the point is to keep it this way.
I'm just getting to the point of wondering whether we have to do anything at all.
It's a good question. Yeah.
And I suppose that's why we are talking to the Glenorchy community. Thanks. Bill, just going, okay, Tim?
Yep, thanks.
Bill, just going back to those costings you mentioned.
Yeah, we have a slide we prepared earlier. I'm not sure if one of the organisers can pull that up. There we go. So I didn't have time to talk this through, but yeah, there are the costs, indicative costs, but based on the engineering design and quantities and unit rates for similar projects. So yeah, firstly, raising that existing Glenorchy flood bank in that sort of 1 to 2 million range. Obviously quite a bit of earthworks and also tree removal to make that happen. By the way, those costs include design, consenting, and construction provisions included in those costs. Again, there's more detail in the reports. For the Dart River, so the new rock fill, and if you remember those red sort of areas highlighted on that map, expensive, 2 to 3 million, relatively speaking. It does cost quite a bit to import and place rock. Vegetation buffers are sort of order of magnitude cheaper. Obviously, they contain a higher degree of risk because you have to, like I said, they have to grow and be established before they're effective at providing bank erosion protection. And then Upper East, option A, so there's a really large order of magnitude in the cost here. Option A, we were actually raising the roads, part of the Glenorchy Paradise Road and Priory Road. The cost of raising roads is expensive, again, relatively speaking. Basically, the cost there is a lot of earthworks, but also pavement and asphalting for the road surface. And just removal of that part of the flood bank on the right bank there to provide a floodway on the right abutment of the bridge in that sort of $500,000 cost range, option B at the bottom of the table there. And that's mainly the earthworks involved and just moving or disposing of that earth offsite. So, yep, if there's any follow-up questions, happy to field those.
Lloyd, last one.
Yeah, that's good. The Dark River, for the protection of the Dark River, is not got any protection for Glenorchy per se. It's more protecting the road that goes around to Kinloch. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it's that sole access route into Kinloch. It's protecting that road.
And does that road service other people beyond Kinloch?
Yeah, Tim might be able to talk to that, or Jean-Luc. Yeah, I know it goes to, I think, the Greenstone Caples walkway.
That's right. The road continues down to Greenstone, where it's provides access to the Greenstone Caples walking tracks. Also the high country stations down that way. Yeah, so it's,
So, well, would there be stock trucks on that road?
I believe so, yes.
I just it's at the end of the day, there's no one thing's going to fix it. Another question I have is like, if you do some work, like say you do your flood bank up, lift your flood bank and back, do a bit of work on the side of the restart. This is for like Glenorchy, because that's really your main centre. Are we going to? What effect is that going to give? Is that going to change a 1 in 20-year flood to a 1 in 50-year flood, or 1 in 50 to 1 in 100 or to 200, or what level of protection is it sort of getting designed to?
Yeah. So for that raising of the Glenorchy flood bank, it basically, the concept design anyway is raising it from a 1 in 20 return period flood, which it currently has, up to a 1 in 100 year flood, including a climate change allowance to the end of the century. So it's going from a 20-year to a 1 in 100 year flood at level of service.
And would it take much more to get it to 1 in 200 years, say?
No, not a lot. I mean, it's sort of you get good bang for your buck if you like. The amount of increase in stop bank height relative to the water level is probably not significant. So I don't have the numbers to hand, but it's something you could definitely consider if you do pursue that option. Sort of a cost benefit of increasing the level of service further, and what's the cost in doing so?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering that, because at the end of the day, as we come back to the communities, cool.
Right, thanks.
Yep.
So Andrew has one very short and small question or comment.
Yeah, these numbers, intervention costs, just triggers the thought around community understanding the costs of not actually doing anything based, what is the overall cost? Is multiple ownership with these assets, what is the overall cost of maintaining them now? That sort of number would be good to have in the conversation with the community. Generally speaking, when you're a ratepayer that's contributing. So yeah, just a thought.
Right. Look, thank you everyone, and thank you very much, Bill and Grant. That's really going to be important to be able to take that to the Glenorchy community. Break, it says. Let's make it a very short break. Say 5 minutes, enough to run around the block a couple of times. We'll get a hot drink and be back here at 2:48. Thank you.
Yeah, that's cool. Oh, okay.
I was thinking there's a walk.
No, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, no, absolutely. And if there's a, yeah. No, that's, and if there's any specific questions. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, then you're off screen.
Been going on for such a long time, I'm still like I know it's annoying.
Yeah.
Well, what we're going to yeah, I think so, because there's these community meetings.
Not that it matters.
I really like well, we need to, I think we need to be aware of
what's going on. Suddenly be hearing people, so they need to be aware of it. But also, what are they doing? Asking for our little guidance or facilitates a discussion about how this information feeds into the adaptation pathway and strategy development.
Wow, awesome. I did not know about Murphy.
Apparently that is
a future.
trauma specialist dog.
Yeah, right.
I don't.
Yeah, it's a friendly
But
dog
it's
that
just
anyone
a,
can
yeah,
pet.
exactly.
And hold things, yeah. Some people get traumatized by dogs though. So. Yeah. Maybe Andrew could do that in his spare time.
Yeah, sure.
Looks like a job for you. Not being a trauma dog, but you have a couple of dogs that might like that.
Brought out a little beagle to just go and say hi to everyone on the bus hub. I guess it's just making the bus hub a little friendly. I don't think it really, it makes me think safer really, but I mean, I've got being there.
Who's got the best nose in the world? Got the dog.
It probably has a multi-purpose, I think, this dog, yeah.
Smell out all those vapes.
Yeah. There'll be that many different smells, they'll be confused.
I think they all.
Yeah, that could be a job for you and your dogs.
I'm not sure that the Jack Russells, they're interested in possums and cats.
Yeah, you're not so interested in being petted at the bus.
Might just chase after the buses or something.
Yeah, wow. They'd get a tune up if they did.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Know what the trouble is with 100 years club? Sometimes you can get two in a row.
That's right.
That's what my question was sort of
Well, I mean,
That's what Kelsey got.
getting at.
What can we do? We have heard that probably no one's going to drown, but then how's it going to get wrecked? Well,
It's people's choice, isn't it?
that's the way it is, I feel.
Just have good warning signs. Get out, get out.
Yeah, and we're getting better. We're getting better at that early morning stuff, aren't we? There's monitors and things.
No, the warning's getting better all the time.
Yeah.
The challenges we have are all those folks up on the track, and it's not our responsibility not to see all those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weather events and things like that, and a slip come down.
You can't protect everything. If you're gonna go walking in the wilderness, you're gonna walk in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And it's not gonna work for you.
Burns will burn tracks, it's real hot.
But the guys.
Friends that went there just the other week,
All right.
and that one's kind of right in the.
I don't think they kill off.
You will check the weather forecast before you go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But he walks.
Forecast, but I mean,
Take a beacon.
yeah, definitely. Going up there. Yeah, AF8. There's no forecast for AF8, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah.
Big roll off thing.
Yeah.
Landslide.
Right, we're ready to go, I think. Well, apart from the panel. Jamie, it'll have to be all over to you.
I hope not.
Right, look, welcome back, everyone. We will resume the meeting and we will hand over to members of the panel. Anne, who's going to take us through the next bit.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for everybody's still holding on with us here. So the next section, I think, will help just a little to draw some of the pieces together and sort of look forward to where we're going with the strategy. So this next section, we're basically going to take a look at sort of the what can we do about it piece of the DAP cycle. So we're looking at having a sort of look at a mosaic of types of responses that we might be considering. So the previous study that was looking at some very specific hazards, problems, and potential responses, and engineering and nature-based solution responses to those particular problems. But this next section, we're going to have a look at a bit more broadly at resilience for the area and take a bit of more of a holistic view of the types of responses we might consider. Where do they fall in areas of responsibility, and how we might go about implementing. And then we're going to have a look at how do we when and how do we need to make decisions in considering our pathways approach to decision making and uncertainty. So we don't necessarily need to make all the decisions now, but there'll be points along the road where we might need to change our path, and how would we include, how do we know when that's happening. And we're looking forward to how does this all fit together in a strategy, and what are our next steps. So that's basically what we're covering in the next 45 minutes. So we're joined online by Paula Blackett from NIWA. So Dr. Paula Blackett is NIWA's principal scientist for environmental social science, and she's had a key role in development of adaptation approaches in New Zealand. So she's been really been supporting this project by providing specialist advice in that area, and helping us to work towards implementing the adaptation pathways approach for natural hazard and risk. So she's been supporting the project for the last few years. Cool. Okay, so we're in the discussion we're moving on to now is what can we do about it? So what we know about the hazards, what we know about the risks, what we've thought about different potential options that we've carried forward, and we've done some other work on those. So we need to think about what is a long list of potential ways to manage natural hazards and adapt to the environmental changes that we are expecting at Head of the Lake. We're ongoing conversation with the community iwi and QLDC, and also emergency management Otago in this state. So we're looking at, what is acceptable, what sort of responses might be acceptable, and that'll lead, and we've got feasibility assessments, we've got socio-economic impact screening. Okaha has been working on a cultural impact screening, and we're also going to engage with the community about potential responses in the next round of community engagement. So we'll be bringing all that information together with all other pieces of information and pulling it together in the strategy and to form the basis for decision making. So this is sort of a long list. This isn't a definitive list necessarily of the things that we could do at Head of the Lake to improve resilience, but it does cover sort of some high points of the types of things that we want to consider. So basically, as we've said, there's no silver bullet to fix everything, but we can look at a mosaic of potential responses and existing responses, and they all contribute towards a more resilient and managing natural hazards. So the ones with the tick are already in place, things that either ourselves or other agencies or the community, everybody is working, or emergency management Otago, we're all working together on various things that already occur up at Head of the Lake, and that add towards our resilience of natural hazards. So this includes, obviously there's already a flood bank, and the road network is already, repaired and maintained when it gets flooded. There's already been behavioural and societal changes with the information that we've been providing over the years. People have been incorporating that into the things that they do and their business plans and those sort of things. Everybody's been contributing to readiness, response and recovery, very important in the area, and improvements to that have been occurring over time. So then we've also developed a monitoring, flood forecasting and early warning system that is implemented now. And so that links in with Emergency Management Otago and the community response group when there's a potentially flooding situation from any of those sources we mentioned. We also there's river management work that goes on, which includes like maintaining the channel, gravel management, and vegetation removal or management as well. The other thing that is important to the community that's come up is Plan B, access to the community. So this is if the road, either the road back to Queenstown or the road out to Kinloch is closed for whatever reason, the boat and wharf access is important to the community. And they've brought that up in some of our discussions. So we've included that on the list as a resilience measure. There's also, as we've discussed, insurance cover and business insurance cover. So that's already in place. And I've included there are existing development rules in place about minimum floor heights in flood areas. And so that's an existing avoid mechanism. Other ones that we can talk about further, but that might be possible in the future would include things like improvements to the flood protection, as we've discussed, road network resilience improvements. There was some discussion in the Tonkin and Taylor report about liquefaction around community-wide grounded improvement, building improvements for liquefaction hazard. So I think it's still on the list, but obviously there's I won't talk about that much further. So in terms of there are also resilience measures that can occur at a property level. So things like floodproofing, floor raising, strengthening of existing buildings, those types of things, resilience measures are available at a property level. We've got the nature-based floodplain interventions that we've mentioned previously. Another potential adaptation response could be to accept a different level of future service. So for example, that could be something to do with a reduced, so it's currently a two-wheel drive accessible road, the local roads, but they may, a potential reduced level of service would be four-wheel drive only, for example. Also, for example, if the river grades more, the existing flood protection in the future might offer a lower level of service just because of the changes to the river aggradation, for example. So risk profiles change over time, and so the level of protection associated with existing services could change with those if we don't do anything. There's some other things on the list involving relocation. So proactive relocation, it's not something that we have a lot of experience with that, but it's on the list as potential because we want to keep options open. So you could have voluntary proactive relocation from higher hazard areas. There also is, the potential for a reactive retreat if there was a significant event and you needed post-event to retreat in that case. Other types of avoid mechanisms could be around revising the development rules and also, no new development or redevelopment, change of land use that might exacerbate risk, so towards avoiding and intensifying development. So as an initial, so I'm happy to receive feedback on that. I thought one of the more immediate questions might just be around, whose area of responsibility in general do these kind of things kind of fall under? At the moment, this is sort of the initial highlighting, just because I assumed everyone would want to know. So There's things that are Otago Regional Council, would generally fall under Otago Regional Council, Queenstown Lakes District Council. I've got one thing highlighted for joint responsibility between ORC and QLDC, individual property owners and business owners. There's a number of things that everyone, you know, would probably want to contribute to. And then there are some of these, you know, conceptual responses that currently don't have a well-defined responsibility. So that's predominant. Now, you might be intrigued about the Glenorchy flood bank, because ORC typically has a responsibility for flood banks. A lot of the flood banks in Otago. The reason it just is a historical, it happens to be that QLDC owns the Glenorchy flood bank, and so I've put it together with their road assets as a current ownership is QLDC. So yeah, any questions from any of that? I sort of give that sort of mosaic of we're not talking about just one single thing, because obviously we don't have a magic bullet, but lots of different things go towards making the potential for making the existing resilience and also improving on resilience potentially over time.
So are there any questions or important comments on that? Elliot, and then Andrew.
I mean, my first question was just going to be asking sort of what that voluntary proactive relocation looked like and who was responsible for it, but it sounds like that's sort of not a defined thing at the moment, so that's very understandable. The other question was just around, it's more of a grammar thing, but potentially big implications on that. No new development, redevelopment or change of land use that may exacerbate risk. Just wondering whether that's like no new development that may exacerbate risk, or whether that's no new development full stop, and then that may exacerbate risk is just for the change of land use thing.
Yeah, I think around development, yeah, it comes down to these tolerability questions, right? So there's an existing development, I mean, people are already there. There's also, you know, potential for new development and change in land use, things like that. So there's a question around what is the tolerance of you know, councils and the community towards those sort of activities in terms of risk to life, risk to property. Obviously, risk to life has been acceptable, so it shouldn't really drive the questions that we have. It's around property.
I think as well, if you're thinking about under an avoid category, it's about thinking about any new development or redevelopment or changes of land use that might, you know, have higher risks, or if you can put that out of high risk areas and things. So it kind of covers a whole lot of different things under that whole kind of category. It wouldn't just be one kind of thing, but thinking about, yeah, no new development in areas that might exacerbate risk or things like that too. Yeah.
And you could, I mean, there'd be some sub areas in various things like that. Like if you had proactive relocation, people would want to know, is there any lower hazard land available for us to move to? You know, that's sort of, some of those conversations have come up with the community as well, because they like the area. So, you know, we're not saying that any of those decisions would be available tomorrow, but, you know, that having them in the plan doesn't, you know, it still leaves the pathway open if all the ducks align for the future.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, I was just wondering about why central government wouldn't be included somewhere, even though perhaps they haven't got a direct day-to-day responsibility, but indirectly, you know, through, you know, funding opportunities, actual partnership funding opportunities and that. Yeah, so I suppose why would they not be included potentially as also an entity with a degree of responsibility?
I agree, we certainly can add them in, and we agree that central does have a role to play, and certainly, it's their suggestions and guidance will come out and which would need to be incorporated into our consideration. So at the moment, yeah, this is just looking at it from, existing systems, implementation processes, yeah. We could also mention like EQC, for example, reinsurance, all those sort of things are in the mix, really. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Please carry on.
Okay, cool. So I guess, yes, basically, if we look at this list, or these sort of concepts of a mosaic of responses that we could work towards, we're talking, business as usual activities, things that we already do and they're already in long-term plans. We're talking individual, household or community level actions, things that the community can implement, things that they already do through their own resilience measures per the household. We're looking at established ways of managing hazards. So these are straightforward sort of things that we do in lots of different places. They're not unusual. That would be any sort of adjustments to the things that we already take care of as part of the work that we do. The other things to cover off this list of responses, some of them would require sort of one-off arrangements. They're a bit out of the box. So if you did want to pursue a proactive relocation plan, obviously that would be needs its own arrangements to do that kind of thing, or community-wide, liquefaction resilience would need those kind of arrangements because they don't currently exist right now. And then the other thing to consider for the case is that if we get an event, there'll be, reactive responses that are needed, and the scale of those would obviously depend on the scale of damage. So yeah, and yeah, basically, yeah, there are different roles and responsibilities for undertaking adaptation action. OIC has one of those roles, but we need obviously to work together with others in order to make an effective adaptation approach. Any questions about any of that?
No, I think carry on.
Okay.
Okay, so
Pass over all of my head for this one. There we go.
Okay, so I'll pick up now. This is where we start to get into the implementation component of the strategy, step 7 in the 10-step decision cycle. And we start to think about things like, within the adaptation pathways, what are the signals and triggers and thresholds we need to think about? What might be the decision-making process, and what are some of the trade-offs and some of the critical things that we need to think about? We'll also just give a very quick example of an adaptation pathway, just so you get a bit of a flavour for what this might look like in practice. Okay, next slide, please. So, as you're probably aware, an adaptation pathways approach really is a way of managing what is known as deep uncertainty. We don't know what the future's going to hold. We don't know how the climate is going to change, how quick it's going to change. So we need to take a very flexible approach, which means that in many cases we'll need to apply different adaptation options, potentially in a sequence, as changes occur over time. So one of the key things in this particular diagram here is to look at that bottom part there. So this is all relative to change. So as environmental factors, as social factors, as economic factors change, we will need to adjust the adaptation options that we are putting into place. And how we do that, we can dig into that a little bit. So I always start with the adaptation thresholds. This is kind of in the middle of this picture, but it's the key kind of point. An adaptation threshold is that thing that you do not want to happen, an unacceptable outcome, be it social, be it environmental, be it cultural, whatever it is unacceptable and we want to avoid it. So we want to be able to change from our current set of adaptation options to a new set before we hit that adaptation threshold. So on that diagram, the adaptation threshold is that vertical red line. Many of the options that we need to implement have a lead time. You can't build stock banks overnight. You can't change developmental rules overnight. You actually need a bit of a lead in time. So that has to be factored in. So in order to give us enough lead in, we need to start thinking about the triggers, which effectively are those decision points in time where we know an adaptation threshold point is approaching based on the things that we are measuring within our community based around what's important to us. So ahead of the trigger, we have signals where we are actually tracking those critical changes and we know that they're changing and we're starting to go, all right, this is going in a trajectory we don't particularly like. We know that there is a trigger coming up and therefore we need to keep an eye on this because we're then going to need to act on that trigger, work with our lead time, change our trajectory to avoid a threshold. When you do change your trajectory and you implement another adaptation option, you will then go into the review and adjust phase where you go, okay, we've changed things around a bit here. And you will then start to measure the effectiveness, and then you'll effectively flick into another cycle where you start to re-monitor everything that you were previously monitoring so that you can be aware of when the next adaptation threshold could be on the horizon. So now we're going to dig into this a little bit more. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So here we start to look more into what some of those signals and triggers might actually be. So let's just have a look at the current approach. So currently we have a flood bank. We've been told that it has an 1 in 20 year level of service. We have in place some hazard awareness and some risk awareness. We have monitoring, we have flood forecasting with some early warning systems, and we have readiness and response in place. We will need to measure a whole lot of different factors in order to make sure that we are tracking the things that we need to track so that we know that there is some kind of a trigger point approaching. Now, these will be a combination of physical, social, cultural, governance, environmental. There'll be a whole mixed bag of them. And with many of these triggers, we actually don't know which one of these is going to go off first. It could be any one of them. It could be a couple of them. It's quite hard to pick. So we need to sort of track key things. So the examples that we've got here of things that are reasonably good signals and triggers are physical ones. What is is there been any flood damage? Do we have repeat damage? Are there any incidents of overtopping of the flood bank? Do we have a change in flood risk? Do we need to, are we tracking this? Do we need to make a change? The social triggers can be things like, are the community becoming increasingly stressed about flood risk? Do we have repeat cleanups going on? Do we have volunteer burnout? Do we have increased level of community pressure coming into the council to try and get some sort of a change? I'm going to skip over the cultural one because that's yet to be determined by mana whenua. The governance ones there might actually be some significant changes in legislation. There might be funding opportunities. There might be breakdown of relationships. These all are also factors which come into play where we need to transition to a trigger point. Economic, maybe things like partial insurance retreats. So the locals in Glenorchy may no longer be able to get flood insurance. They might still be able to get fire, theft, all the other package, but they may not be able to get flood insurance. It might be harder for people to get mortgages. They might start to experience some stress related to the ongoing maintenance and repair costs. And again, we haven't gone into defining the environmental signals and triggers in this example. But each one of these things gives us a bit of an idea of those things that we should be tracking or could track so that we know that there is a trigger approaching, so that we know that there is a threshold on the horizon. So if we can flick to the next slide, please. So once we do have a trigger, where do we go? We have this lead time and we have to skip to a different option along our pathway. It can be any one of these. we can, and it could be several of these. There's no, taking one action here does not preclude taking any of the others. You could take a few. You can actually track between them. You could start with accommodate and then move through into a protect or into a retreat. You can sort of organise them in a variety of ways. But each time you're considering where to go, there's a whole raft of other things which need to be considered. So when you're sort of evaluating which track you might take, there are obviously a bunch of financial costs versus benefits to consider. There is community acceptability. Do the community actually like this option? Is it something that they can live with? There will be environmental and natural amenity factors that need to be considered as well. Glenorchy is, aesthetically very pleasing. It's very popular with tourists, is what we're putting in there. Interfere with that? Is it going to impact the aesthetics of the area? There'll be cultural considerations. There'll be long-term sustainability options here. Some of these options will have lifespans. As example, if the accommodate option is put into place, it may work for a while. If the floods are relatively small and the stock bank's not overtopped, then suddenly there may be a big event, there may be overtopping, and then suddenly you're flicking into something else. The natural knowledge of the natural hazards in the area may shift and may suddenly get some new information that tells us we need to evaluate things differently. We need to consider maladaptation. Is the option that we're taking locking us into some sort of an undesirable future, or is it going to lock us into paying ongoing costs? How do we put these pathways together? Who was going to think about? And probably one of the key things that requires consideration is that for many things, there is always an element of residual risk apart from retreat. Retreat completely removes the problem of residual risk, but for every other one of those options, it is still there. And there is still the potential for events that could come well over the top of the existing stock bank or any new stock banks. And it's all sort of a combination of all these things. And I guess this is where, again, it's that interaction between the council, between the community, to work through these to figure out what the next step within the pathway is. Okay, so we can flip to the last slide. So just a quick sort of summary. So we've got triggers are those points where you have to make a decision and you start to begin that evaluation of, well, what is our next option? They could be physical, cultural, social, governance, economic, or environmental, or all of the above. One of those may go off before the others, and we won't know until the trigger arrives. Adaptation pathways must always include that monitoring for signals and triggers so that we can see that threshold is on the horizon and we can respond in time. Some triggers may arise suddenly, particularly when it comes to flood risk, because we can suddenly get a flood, which may rapidly flick us from one course of action into another. There's also a considerable amount of factors to consider when making any decision about the next step in the pathway. There's a number of trade-offs, as you've heard kind of repeatedly through this afternoon session. Perfect solutions are difficult to come by in this kind of complex environment. No matter what is done, and no matter what sequence of adaptation options is put into play, trade-offs will be required. Okay, has anybody got any questions or comments?
I'm looking around the room for questions or comments, not at this stage. That must have been thoroughly covered. Thank you very much, Paula.
That's all right, no problem.
Now, look, I'm sure there will be a bit further discussion. I'm aware some other people do need to get away on time at 3:30, so we've got 10 minutes just to wrap things up. So over to the panel to see what you'd like to bring up in this last bit.
Yeah, so the last bit really just kind of wants to look forward into what kind of we've got going on next. So you've heard a lot of new information today and kind of we've talked about the adaptation pathways concepts and what this kind of all means and what we're looking towards next. But really you know, we're heading towards a strategy, and what that is going to look like is it's aiming to provide a really comprehensive picture of everything that we kind of know so far and provide that framework for moving forward. So that first kind of bit of the strategy is around that foundational knowledge, like what science, technical studies, Mātāuraka Māori, community engagement, local knowledge, pulling all of that work together. And it just provides a really transparent base where we can show all of the information that we have to make robust decisions. The second part is, you know, providing that strategic framework and that, you know, the direction for where we want to be and what adaptation should really be working towards. So that'll align quite closely with the OIC strategic directions, but also what we've heard from the community and kind of those objectives for how we make decisions and where we want to get to. And so this is kind of leaning on, yeah, as I said, work with the community and also kind of best practice guidance around where we should be heading and also other kind of strategic framing. And then we have the action plans. So thinking about what tangible actions and do we have to implement the strategy. So what the kind of things are we already doing now through usual approaches, through outlined in the LTP, and show how this kind of fits underneath that strategic framework and how that adaptation piece kind of comes together. And it will outline different actions, not just necessarily the natural hazards team, but things that we're already doing across OIC and with our partners that fall under this umbrella of adaptation. So thinking around that adaptation pathways plan that you've just kind of been heard about, and or thinking about integrated floodplain management, infrastructure, liquefaction management, land use planning, and monitoring for those triggers and things, and also community preparedness. So how this all kind of comes under adaptation and what we're doing here, and then also how we will monitor and review the strategy and track that progress and things. So these action plans will kind of highlight things that we're already doing and some of the changes that have already been happening because of the work as part of this program, and outline kind of steps for moving forward as well. So what's next? Well, we have a really robust understanding of the hazards and risks. This is quite significant. We have a really, really strong knowledge base for understanding what's occurring at the head of Lake Whakatipu and how this will impact kind of what matters to people and what's important to the community. And that's, yeah, it's kind of probably reasonable to say that we have probably one of the more well understood places in Otago with the level of information that we have. So that's, yeah, a really great place to be at this part of the program. We're having ongoing discussions with QLDC and Emergency Management Otago staff about what all this information means, how we can collaborate, roles and responsibilities for moving forward, and also ongoing community engagement with the head of the lake community. You know, we've been building on these relationships for years and having, you know, many conversations with the community in a number of ways. And then the aim for the end of the year is to deliver the draft strategy. So a reminder that that's that kind of foundational knowledge piece, the strategic framework, and the action plans. But just to kind of note that adaptation is ongoing, and this strategy will kind of give us that common direction moving forward. So it's bringing everything together. Specifically, we've got a few things kind of coming up. So in a couple of weeks' time, we have a workshop with the QLDC councillors just to kind of give them an update on this program. We've also got some community engagement activities to really talk through what we've kind of covered today. So thinking about presenting the findings of this these new reports from Becca and Dam Watch, but also thinking about adaptation pathways and some of those tricky conversations and things that around what adaptation means for the future. So that's the next phase of community engagement, and then just signalling that our next update to councillors will be at the Safety and Resilience Committee meeting in November. Yeah. That's kind of all from us, but if you've got any questions or comments, otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie. Any final comments from councillors or other members of the room? Tim.
Yeah, look, I've just been really impressed with the depth of the work that's gone into all of this. Not many questions because perhaps you've answered a lot of them. So no, well done. Congratulations.
Andrew.
Yeah, along similar lines, I think that sort of reassured that life and limb aren't at stake. sort of an acceptable tolerance in that area, and knowing what we're required to do as a regulatory authority to inform communities about the natural hazard risks in the district. And if it was at a much higher level in terms of life and limb, I would be feeling a bit more jittery about going forward. But yeah, knowing that the direction that the community take is in their hands to a certain degree, I feel, rather than having to be pushed. Yeah, no, well done.
Yeah, and I could say, look, this paper shows us, moving from hazard to risk and incorporating in there or realising in there the importance of how we communicate that in engaging with our communities. And I know that later in the year, or possibly early next year, there'll be further papers on looking regionally at risk again, that idea of moving from, we know about the natural hazards, but moving on to the risk, which is taking a whole lot of other things into consideration as well. And on that slide there, we see that, yes, you've got the workshop with QLDC coming up, and of course they're intimately involved in this, as well as those 2 community sessions, 10th and 11th of September in Glenorchy. So we hope those go extremely well, and there will be some councillors in attendance. So perhaps we do wrap up at that point. Tim, over to you for a moment.
So I just wanted to take the chance to thank our consultant guests for presenting all their findings and for their hard work in completing those reports. So thank you, Anna, Marcus and Elliot from Becca, and Bill and Grant from Damwatch for their insights today.
Yes, no, absolutely go along with that, and to our team up front for all your continuing good work on this. So look, I'll just close this off with Karakia, just checking I haven't forgotten anything else. No, we know what's coming next, so that's all good. So here we go. Kia tauta rangi Māori e ki runga I ngā iwi maka awa. Let peace reign all the peoples of the world. Thank you very much, everyone. See you another day. Thank you.